So, that pesky word God means a lot of different things to different people. I would say it means something different to every single person who uses it, including those who are atheists. Among all those various understandings of God, one of the most prominent ideas is a sense of power and greatness. Some might even say omnipotent. And while a great, big, supremely powerful God resonates for a whole bunch of people in the world, it might seem a little foreign for most Unitarian Universalists. But still, there are some much smaller ways of describing God. For a long time, liberal theologians have talked about a God that fits within our scientific world, rather than lording over it or jumping in from time to time to fix things in a sort of arbitrary manner. Today, I want to explore some of those smaller descriptions of the sacred. And before I go too quickly down that theological rabbit hole, it's worth remembering in our lives and in nature, some of the most powerful things are the smallest and most fragile. It's a little bit cliche, but the ability of water and even air to wear away stone over time speaks volumes about the impact of gentle forces if they are persistent. And though it's only one phase of life, the journey of seed and egg makes all complex life possible, for animals as well as plants. From a giant redwood down to the squirrel that scurries through her branches, tiny, tiny cells of reproduction make it possible. Even everyone in this room grew from 2 tiny cells. We know flowers are beautiful. Oftentimes we mistake them as fragile or frivolous things even. But in fact, their magic is what's responsible for the food that sustains our life. The smallest things can be mighty. And within our human community, love and compassion have as much power to shape the world as violence and force. After all, we would not have survived very long as infants without a really powerful ingrained drive to care for one another. I know not everyone is on board with this, but I believe that generosity, diplomacy, education play as large a part in shaping our world as military might does. There's a whole lot of power in the small and gentle. And as we explore the possibility of a smaller God today, if that word God is a sticking point for you, I invite you to settle into an opportunity to celebrate the smaller goods of our lives. Not everything has to be grand to be worthy of our attention and gratitude. One of the books that has most influenced my own beliefs in recent years is by Jerome Stone. The title of his book and the big idea is A Minimalist Vision of Transcendence. And I wish I could recommend reading the book, but I don't. It is not a fun book, but it describes something that's really important. He argues that reverence is a supremely important virtue in our world today that seems to have fallen by the wayside. It's not important so that we can be pious, good people on our high horses. Reverence is important because it gives us a sense of gratitude and meaning in our lives. If nothing is special or important, then life has little meaning. And that's a miserable way to pass the days. But when we can cultivate a sense of appreciation for the sacred around us, a sense of meaning and purpose emerges. Reverence brings some deeper joy in the good times and a source of hope in the times of challenge. It also creates a little bit of a moral framework that we can use to create our wider world. For example, when we Unitarians speak up and write letters about women's rights or homelessness or about immigration or a slew of other things, we lift up our first principle. We speak about the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That reverence, that shared recognition of the sacredness of humans, gives structure to our moral lives, both as individuals and as a wider community. And without some sense of reverence, we're kind of unmoored from a sense of moral responsibility. Reverence is really important. But that leaves the big fat question, reverence for what exactly? And Jerome Stone set out on this mission to explore the smallest, the minimalist version of transcendence, something that we could find reverence for. To describe it, he tells the story about finding comfort when he needed it most. He remembers receiving the phone call that his own father had died. After the call, he sat in the living room on the sofa, slumped over and distraught. And his daughter, at that point, only 8 years old, asked, "What's wrong?" "Oh, Dad," she said when she heard the news, and threw her arms around him. The hug, he explains, was an unexpected and freely given gift of comfort and love. What religious people call grace. For him, this gift was not a work of a personal God, nor was it a meaningless event. He understands his daughter's hug as transcendent grace because it came from outside of the situation. It was a surprise. Jerome Stone talks about a minimalist vision of transcendence because he wants to say that the sacred doesn't have to be huge. In fact, it can be tiny. He argues for the absolute smallest version, the individual moments of good. We all know that that good bubbles up in our lives. We may have experienced some of it this morning. But he says there's no evidence that those moments are connected. They might just be individual. And since there's no evidence that they're connected, there's no evidence that they're pointing in some direction. And with no direction, there's no evidence of someone orchestrating that direction. What we're left with in Jerome Stone's vision is simple, individual moments of transcendence. And those moments, each on their own, are adequate reason for us to find gratitude and meaning in life. It's a very minimal approach to faith, but it's pretty amazing. If we pay attention, the little things can add up. Another angle on reverence and God that I want to mention is much older. Friedrich Schleiermacher, as you might have guessed, was German. He made his career in the early 1800s around the same time that Unitarians here in the United States were charting our course as a new type of faith. He was writing during the Enlightenment to people who were kind of rejecting the old faith. They were newly invested in science, but there was a problem. The old doctrines of the church weren't really describing that religious experience that they were feeling, and reason and science didn't quite capture it either. Schleiermacher was actually a hugely influential writer. He shaped a good half of what came after him in terms of theology. He pointed out that religion isn't so much about knowing or doing. It's not about intellectually believing the right things or enacting the right rituals or morality. He said, Religion is really about feeling. And one feeling in particular he described as religion. It's the feeling of absolute dependence. He said that along with our self-awareness as humans comes this realization that our existence is dependent. None of us arose out of nothing. I can't help but be reminded of our seventh principle, our honoring of the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. So for Schleiermacher and for generations of thinkers that came after him, it was this very human experience of knowing ourselves to be limited and longing for something bigger than ourselves, longing for a reunification with that which is reliable and infinite. That feeling, he said, was the cornerstone of religion. And God is in that awareness, that calling, that draw toward wholeness. This isn't a God that's going to break the laws of nature to fix your problems in the moment, but it is a God that can provide some comfort and meaning and make some sense of that feeling that most of us have had. And there's one last version of a smaller God that I want to offer you today. In her book, A God That Could Be Real, Nancy Abrams writes a theology that's kind of the ultimate blasphemy of most faith traditions. I think that's why I find it fascinating. She argues that God emerged out of human creativity and that God is real. This is a bit more complicated than it sounds. It hinges on a couple of ideas. One is emergence, and the other is about human striving. But let's talk about emergence first. This is something that we've all experienced, but probably haven't thought much about. Emergence occurs when something real emerges from its parts, but as something bigger and more complex and being its own thing. When the sum is greater than its parts. For example, in the field of biology, life is an emergent property of chemistry. You and I are much more than the oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen molecules that make up our bodies, right? Something emerged there that is very different. It happens all over the place, in fact. It happens when matter and order came together after a Big Bang. It happened with the emergence of life. It also happens within human culture. It happened as we created an economy, a very real thing that is bigger than the sum of its parts, or as we create language that's much more than sounds or the people making those sounds. The other key concept that the author talks about is the uniqueness of human aspiration. In the vastness of space, she talks about how incredibly rare it was that a planet like ours emerged, or that life emerged, or that thought emerged, or that we creative human beings emerged from all of that vast space. And in our bizarre, unlikely emergence, we came to make sense and have gratitude for that, and developed beliefs in God and gods and goddesses and the mystery. There is within us an inclination toward religiosity. And from this human aspiration emerged something new. God emerged. And God is real, she argues. Again, this isn't a God that intercedes in human life or breaks the laws of nature, but it's a God that can inspire compassion and reverence and bring meaning to lives and appreciation for this unique, fragile planet of ours. It's kind of a creation story in reverse. Rather than God creating all that is, the opposite happened. Over billions of years, out of stardust and evolution and human aspiration, emerged a God that could be real. This God didn't create the universe, it created the meaning of the universe. Many among us have suggested, I have heard, that we humans made up God. But the same could be said for nations and our economy and several other things that are very, very real. So I've talked a lot about God today. For some of us, that word is not useful at all. Perhaps the word was made synonymous with power and judgment from traditions of those people's past. They made a hard step of saying, I'm not interested in that God. Or coming from the other liberal end of the religious spectrum, some people say that using the word God is unnecessary for describing something that's embedded in nature and in the universe. And that's totally fine. Those are great reasons for not using the word God. And for some people, using it is helpful because it plugs them into a bigger conversation about faith. And even when they mean something very different, they can still participate in that conversation. For some people, because God was important in their history, it's more helpful to redefine the word than to totally get rid of it. And that is a totally okay reason for using the word. For some of us, the word God just works, and for some, it doesn't. I frankly don't care one way or the other. What I do care about is that we notice the sacred moments in our lives. I hope that we see and appreciate our interdependence. And I hope from time to time that we recognize how blessed we are, or perhaps how lucky we are, to be able to live on this enchanted, fragile planet together. Amen.